Something of the same thing applies to politics, but here with later certainty about what the new pattern is. Striking fact. If you look at the world's major political regimes in 1900 or even 1910, they were predominantly monarchies or empires. Again, some interesting exceptions, but predominantly in most parts of the world. If you look at the dominant political regimes of the early 21st century, these systems are largely gone. A huge change, not just compared to the long 19th century, but compared to the longer history of agricultural societies in the world. What the alternatives were, however, was less clearly established. Democracies, in some instances, perhaps a growing number of instances, replaced monarchies and empires. But other candidates, still successful in the early 21st century, included authoritarian regimes, communist systems. It's clear that the old political systems had stopped working with very few exceptions. Less clear whether there would be a single agreed-upon alternative that would take their place. Women's affairs, and again we'll talk more extensively about this in a later discussion, women's affairs or gender relationships also seem to enter a clear new period in this contemporary world history era. Older systems of patriarchy began to be modified by efforts to give women the vote, improve their educational levels, provide them some new legal rights, even by the later 20th century, even reduce average birth rates in almost every region of the world, though at different rates. On the other hand, it was not clear exactly how you define the gender system that would replace the old system. It wasn't yet, at least, clearly egalitarian. It hadn't clearly worked out on a global basis what women's economic roles should be. It hadn't clearly worked out some issues of ongoing or renewed male violence against women. We can see change. It's valid to see the contemporary period partly defined by significant shifts and new questions about gender relations. But defining the new is not as easy as suggesting that the old was beginning to disappear. And finally, this is very much the case, and again we'll have an explicit discussion of this, very much the case when one turns to culture. The contemporary period of world history sees a clear set of new challenges to certain kinds of older cultural beliefs. Challenges coming from communism, from a greater mass appeal of nationalism, and from consumerism and science, values that were emphasized in places like the West and Japan. But first of all, these new cultural options didn't entirely agree with each other. And second of all, quite clearly, they had not, by the early 21st century, clearly succeeded in displacing the old, most notably the hold of world religions. The cultural map of this contemporary period of world history was exceedingly complicated, and one can't even say for sure that the older patterns that had prevailed previously had been definitively vanquished. Point one then, in addition to the preliminaries on the complexities of the period itself. Point one, it's possible, certainly in social structure, almost certainly in political regimes, fairly extensively in gender relationships, it's possible very clearly to see that something new began to go on in the world beginning fairly early in the 20th century. Less clear, particularly aside from the replacement of the old upper class socially, less clear how the world would come to define what the alternative system would turn out to be, or whether there would in fact be a clear decision about this at all. And in the cultural realm, lots of change, lots of effervescence, lots of real conversions to new patterns of belief, but no overall clarity at all as to what was going to become core, become central in global cultures. And possibly culture will remain, at least for a long time, one of those areas, and this isn't a new phenomenon in world history either, where you simply have to say you can't define the period in this category. You have to look on a case-by-case basis, despite the presence of some overarching trends and questions. The clearest way to begin a more coherent definition of this new period in world history, and particularly the clearest reason to begin essentially with World War I, involves the shift away from several of the dominant patterns of the long 19th century and even to some extent aspects of the early modern period. Clearest here in turn, remember we're going to talk about the world economy next time. Clearest here in turn is the relative decline of the West. This, I have to say, is somewhat controversial. Sometimes people get upset about this, particularly if the United States is included in the West. So I want to be clear. Relative decline, first of all, does not necessarily mean absolute decline. Many people worried during the period between the world wars, many people worried that the West was really beginning to fade, as Rome had faded earlier, or other analogies of this sort. The revival of Western Europe, the success of the United States after World War II, may well have put these fears permanently to rest. We don't yet know, obviously, the future. There are continued concerns that 50 years hence, Western Europe will simply be less significant than it is today, and there may even be some questions about the United States staying power. But to date, this century has not seen, from an internal standpoint, this century has not seen a clear decline in Western affairs. And indeed, Western Europe has been remarkable in post-World War II particularly, in its ability to absorb loss of power, particularly loss of colonies, without denting basic economic, political, and cultural dynamism and capacity to innovate. We're also not arguing that the West has somehow declined relatively so much that it's still not and perhaps the major player in world power politics. But I think the evidence here is compelling, and again, I think it begins to show itself in World War I. World Wars I and II, in many senses, can be seen, apart from their global dimensions, which are also important, as a giant internal civil war within the West, in which the West accelerated its inability to maintain its power position in the world because of the amount of damage different Western societies inflicted on each other in not just one, but two major conflicts. Economic damage, huge population losses, erosion of the capacity to rule other parts of the world, etc. The measurements of relative decline that are particularly important, I think, are twofold, although again we'll have to talk about a world economy angle here next time as well. First of all, military. Of course, in the early 21st century, the West, particularly if the U.S. is included, still possessed the greatest amount of military power in the world as a whole. The U.S. way ahead of the whole pack. But the capacity of the West, the capacity that was so obvious in so many parts of the world during the long 19th century, the capacity of the West to move almost at will militarily, clearly had stopped by the second half of the 20th century.